This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. Sarah, we normally start with the time of the day, and I'm not going to start with the time of the day today because the message today is across the board. It goes across all time zones and all the zones of life that I can think of. And the conversation this morning that I'm recommending we engage in is called The Life of Business. Now, to introduce the life of business is me, more correctly it is I, Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley, the voice of Respectonomics, and we're going to be, as I say, looking at the life of business today. And in terms of the calendar in the town of Blue Mountains, near Georgian Bay, and your life in Burlington, roughly speaking?
Yes.
Yeah. It's good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, Jeremy. Good morning, everyone.
And good morning, Sarah. Good morning, everybody. I want to sort of give this a little bit of background, what we're going to be talking about. This is part of probably a 10-part series. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, and you will find, our listeners will find, that we're going to be going over ground that we have either referred to or specifically covered in the past. And the reason for doing this is really to bring us all up to the starting gate now. And the starting gate is to understand the whole concept of life in business. We talk about life of business quite correctly, but we're going to be talking about life in business. And in order to do this, Sarah, I think there's one or two things that we should bring to the table. First of all, the origin of Respectonomics. It needs to be reminded, because I think the last time we talked about it was probably 6 months ago.
Right.
And I don't want to go through all of the sort of the permutations of how we got there, but there is one very important issue here, and that is Peter Drucker, the late Peter Drucker, the management consultant, said you should always gather all of your employees together in a business, or whatever the business is, gather everybody together, everybody, and you ask one question, and you do this once a year, and the question is, what is our business? So it brings everybody back to sort of almost a ground zero of what is our business.
That point of origin, yes.
The point of origin, which then led us to another perspective, which is if it's true to say of a business, of an entity, what is our business, then it just as much applies to the human being. That I too can stand up, look in the mirror, if you will, and say, what is my business? Right. Now, we said a moment ago, Peter Drucker said, you got to have everybody at the meeting. You can't just have the CEO or the janitor. You've got to have everybody there.
Right.
And at the same token, if we're going to look at what is my business, what is our business as a human being, we have to bring the constituent parts of us to the table. That means I have to bring my body, my mind, and we refer to it as inner being, soul, spirit. Which right. One do you prefer? I always get this muddled in my head.
It's funny. I think I use interchangeable words. Right. Sometimes I'm talking about my soul. Sometimes I'm talking about my not necessarily inner being, but an alignment.
Right. Okay.
I refer to it as an alignment within myself.
Right. Well, right. Yeah. But I think it's interesting, 92% of the population has spiritual beliefs. So while it's tempting to sort of say, oh, well, let's talk about that somewhere else and, off campus, if you will, truth of the matter is it's intrinsic and it's inherent and it belongs to every human being. That we are made up of this body, mind, let's call it soul for the moment, body, mind, and soul. And so these are the three that we're going to bring to this meeting to discuss with each other, with the independent parts, to say, what is our business?
Right.
Now, if you are looking in the business model itself, and, you take an organization and you ask this question, what is the business of the individual? And I know full well, experientially, anecdotally, by observation, empirically, and any other way you want to look at it, and I know that the human being has been demoted.
And just so you and I may have concept or understanding of what that means. What do you mean by that for our listeners?
The principal point is that we, the human being in an organization, has been increasingly unitized, increasingly made into a sort of almost like a robotic token.
Mm.
There's a story that came out this weekend that 86% of human resource decisions will be made by AI.
Interesting.
Yeah. So you can sort of see all of the ways that these things are infiltrating and effectively pushing the human being to the side. And the critical point about this is that this conversation is going to focus on corporations, but the truth is the corporation could be just as well a marriage, it could be a service club, it can across the board. But the word corporation is interesting. Are you ready for a reason why it's of interest? Would you please? We've talked about rolling the drums. You're not allowed to roll your eyes.
I was just going to say drum roll.
What?
Drum roll?
Oh, drum roll. Yes, drum roll's fine. Yeah, I don't want eye roll. No, it comes from the Latin. Come on. It's from the Latin corpus, meaning a body. So that if you look at any body, literally walking down Main Street, Wall Street, wherever you are, if you look at down the street, you see these bodies. And I will make one sidebar bet with you. Those are living bodies. You don't usually find dead bodies on the street. I mean, if you do, it's a horrific situation. Yeah. But generally speaking, wherever you are, whether it's in the subway, on the highways, walking the trails, people are living bodies. Mm-hmm. And should we say that's pretty obvious? I think we can say that's obvious, Jeremy. What is your point? You can say that to me.
Right, yes.
The point is this, that a corporation is a living body. It's a living entity.
Right.
And if that livingness is marginalized, hijacked, or even suffocated, the corporation will die. Right. And therefore, the actual humanity that's contained within a business is vitally important. We can have all of these tools. We can have our AI, we can have our computers, we can have all these fancy lasers and algorithms and all that kind of stuff. But let me remind myself, you self, and everybody else self, one thing. Take the most complicated, complex economic equation you can think of. It could be cross-border transfers of capital to do with unsecured credits. I mean, think of something absolutely outrageously complicated. However complicated that transaction is, at the very beginning, the start of the transaction, and at the conclusion or the terminus of that transaction is the human being.
I was just going to say, really, people are the heart.
Yeah.
Or the center or the core.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Translated into all those words, the heart, the values, and so on. The truth of the matter is, the translation is still, we have a human being, the alpha and the omega, the A and the, now do you say Z or Z? What do you say?
Well, I've lived both places, so sometimes I say Z, sometimes I say Z.
Yes, well, I want to sound bilingual, so I'm going to say Z and Z. But we are, seriously, the A and the Z of the alphabet is the human being, the one at the beginning and the one at the end. That's the way the whole business starts and finishes. Now, in other words, bringing life to the corporation is not only essential, it's what, you ready for another Latin one? Last one of the Latin today, I promise you.
I don't believe you, but yes, I am ready.
Okay. It's called the sine qua non, without which it is not. Meaning, in other words, if you don't have life in the corporation doesn't exist, the corporation dies. And it sounds horribly harsh and cruel, but it's true. So if we're going to look then at the human aspect within a corporation, this is really the heartbeat of Respectonomics. Respectonomics has two, what you might call creeds or aspirations. The first one is to restore, regain, rebuild the dignity of the human being. Anytime we take the dignity of the human being and marginalize it, we run the risk of the human being going, frankly, into the wilderness, disappearing. And when you do that, the corporation has just lost a useful body.
Right.
Or life has lost a useful body. So in other words, it's critically important that we dignify the other human being. But with that, somebody said to me one day, said, what's the business of respectonomics? What we've just talked about is the aspiration. The business of respectonomics is to honor other people's freedom of choice. And, we live in a world where you hear words, well, it's entirely in your world of of HR, but you hear the words of, equality, inclusiveness, equity. You hear all those words. Nothing could be more critically valuable to the human race than our ability to honor other people's freedom of choice.
Would you also say that it's important to honor, just as important to honor ours, and that's also honoring other people's?
Bingo, bango. That's a very important point, because in honoring, let's say, your freedom of choice, which sounds morally wonderful and all that, the one obstacle to doing that is, do I allow myself freedom of choice?
Right.
And therein lies a critical issue. How many times, go back into childhood days or corporate mentorship, wherever you want to be, and how many times have you heard that line, oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you? And you have these boundaries and you have these chains, and it's sort of like one of those oak caskets with bindings around it. You remember those things you see in the liquor
Hearing guilt
stores?
is
Mm-hmm.
how I would coin those, right?
Yeah. And they're put around us. And I consider these to be artificial boundaries. I think we have invented them, or they have been put upon us, maybe by coaching, maybe by environment. Let's not get
And we're
too
not
carried
born
away.
with them, they're learned.
They're learned. And the thing is, if I'm going to honor your freedom of choice, I've got to give myself that same freedom. Now,
Yeah.
I will state to me the obvious. The choices that are available to me are different from your choices. So, for example, I probably would not make a very good ballet dancer. I don't know about you. Would you make a good ballet dancer?
I might have many years
Well,
ago.
there you go. Yeah. So in other words, it's in your encyclopedia. But the point I'm getting to is that we, as far as what we can, if we're going to honor somebody else's choice, we need to honor our own choices. Number one. Number two, when I'm going to honor my choices, when I'm going to break down these artificial boundaries, I think it's perfectly reasonable then, once again, to come back to the essence of the human being, which is the body, the mind, and the spirit. Now, if I'm going to accommodate the body and the mind and the spirit, I have two themes with which I can operate. One is under the heading of necessary existence, meaning the things I need to exist, period.
The requirements,
The requirements for life.
non-negotiables,
Yeah.
yes.
Now, I should tell you, in fact, you know this, I know you know this, we have what's called the living compass. And the living compass is a schematic that brings all these points together, and you can sort of more or less fill in the gaps and the blank spaces, fill in the blanks. We're deliberately not presenting that document at the moment because we want to treat this almost philosophically, almost say to everybody, put away your pens, put away your pads, put away your notes, put away your computer, and just hear us out of listening to what happens when the body and the mind and the spirit are allowed to operate freely in this case, a corporate setting.
Right.
So that's what we want to explore, and that's what this series is effectively going to be about. The key here is body, mind, and spirit. We're going to talk about the necessities of existence, but there's also then two parts to our lives. There's the living, that just living, but there's also the thriving.
Very
And
different.
very different and excitingly different. But we need, like all things in life, you got to have the foundations in place first. So if we look at life just as a case of existing and nothing else, but just I exist, you end up with, I put this into alphabetical order. And the reason I put it into alphabetical order is because then nobody has to say, oh, but so-and-so's more important, or one element's more important than another.
Fair enough.
So that's the reason for doing it this way. And here we have them. We need food, we need light, we need oxygen, we need people, we need shelter, and we need water. Those are actually an alphabetical sequence. Believe it or not. I did the alphabet. But Sarah, the thing is that if we take each of those things, most people would say, yeah, that makes sense. If I'm going to live, I'm going to need food and shelter and water. Those are the things we glibly talk about. But in fact, the list is a little longer because you need light and you need people and you need shelter. And the main points are, as I say, the food, the light, the oxygen, people, shelter, and water. Those are the main constituents for living, period.
Right.
So far, so good?
So far, so good.
Yeah. Or as they say in the sales world, are you with me?
We are with you. We are on board.
Okay. Well, I trust the listeners are as well. So what we're talking about here is the constituents of living. We are agreeing that the necessities of a corporation is that we have the livingness, the livinghood of a human being giving life to the corporation. Without the life, the corporation dies. So what is it that life needs? And these are the points that we need. Now, the human being is made up of these three components that we've talked about: the body, the mind, and the spirit or the soul. And here's the catch, not even the catch. Here is the sort of the gauntlet that is facing all organizations. It doesn't matter whether it's a marriage or whether it's a major manufacturing entity, a new technology, whatever the organization is, when you have two or more people gathered together, basically, these principles apply. And they're not really principles. They are actually working standards that need to be taken very seriously. And we could go through all of this rather quickly, so I'd rather not go through it too quickly. But to make the point, if we take, and I'm just going to use food as one example, we've agreed alphabetically that food is necessary for the life of the human being.
Yeah.
Yeah. The human being is made up of body, mind, and spirit. Now, here's the question. What is the corporation doing for me that engages my body with food, my mind with food, and my spirit with food?
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, a lot of corporations would say, well, we're going to look after you to feed your body. We do that with wages. We're going to look after your mind. And we're going to do that because we're going to provide you with training and education and all kinds of support mechanisms. Right. So we know that the body and the mind are well taken care of. Most corporations, and when you talk to the leaders and you say, yes, but what are you doing for the spirit or the soul of the human being? You invariably get a rolling eye. You get that look of, well, it's not really our business.
Well, I think it's because they're not used to the terminology of soul, so they're equating it with something different than maybe an overall understanding of what that actually means.
Right. But you see, the issue is that, and the example I've used many a time, is you go in and you buy this very, very upscale bicycle. And as you buy this upscale bicycle and deal is settled, and as you go through, walk it out through the door, the salesperson says, oh, by the way, you only get 2/3 of the chain. So It doesn't really matter how good your bicycle is. It doesn't matter whether it's got ABS and who knows what else it's meant to have, titanium and all that stuff, has all that. But if you've got 2/3 of the chain, it ain't going to go nowhere.
Right.
The mathematical, sorry?
It's worthless.
It is. It is worthless. It's a very good point you make that it is worth less. And that is when we only have 2/3 of the chain, we are in fact going to be in a place where we can pedal furiously and go nowhere. It's exhausting and we will lose our balance.
You're not going to achieve the results that are intended with the purpose of that. Right?
Yeah. But I do have for our listeners one possibly the most important point of the message today. How many times I have said to, and I say a CEO, but somebody in a ranking managerial position, I have said, we are made up of body, mind, and soul. And I instantly get what I call the rolling eye look, the sort of that wrinkle, yeah, we don't talk about that. And without exaggerating, in 99 times out of 100, that same individual looks at me and says, yeah, you're right.
Yes.
So I think we're dealing with a homespun truth. And I think you've very correctly pointed out, it's not a word that fits into the normal corporate lexicon.
Right.
The truth of the matter is, this body, this mind, and this spirit are the constituent parts that need to be fed. They need to be engaged. They need light. They need shelter. They need oxygen. And a corporation or a business, whatever that organization is, it can be a marriage, whatever it happens to be, has a responsibility to engage with the individual on those three levels, the body, the mind, and the spirit, with oxygen, with water, with shelter, whatever it might be. And it's extremely personal. One of the things that people will notice is when they get this or see the what's it called, the compass, the living compass, when they get this chart, they'll notice that all the words that has the I in it, they've all been highlighted in black. And the black has got nothing to do with it. It's the highlighting that matters, because that little I represents you and me. This is extremely personal. This is where you will have a different identification, perhaps from me or from our producer or anybody. The truth of the matter is, it is extremely personal. But here's where the major catch comes in. We just talked about how a corporation will look after me in terms of body, mind, and soul. We've talked about that. I think we beaten up on that subject?
Yeah.
Good. When you turn the piece of paper over, either electronically or physically, when you turn the piece of paper over, it is absolutely identical on the other side. And there's a reason for that. Because the side we've just been talking about is, what will the organization do for me?
Mm-hmm.
When you flip it over, the responsibility changes to, what am I going to do for the corporation? How do I feed the body of the corporation? How do I feed the mind of the corporation? How do I feed the soul of the corporation?
And this is where I think the incredible value comes from Respectonomics and the teachings, the resources, the tools that you have in Respectonomics repertoire, in terms of, one, helping corporations, small companies. As you said, it has tremendous breadth,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
From an impact standpoint. But the ability for Respectonomics to maybe segue that soul word that we're not used to in terminology in certain environments,
right,
but articulating what that actually means in their environment, and then being able to show how Respectonomics can impact positively and draw the attention to, as you say, both of those sides, not just the corporation, but the individual. It's a reciprocal.
It is reciprocal, and it's collaborative. It's accretive, meaning that when one builds the other builds the other.
Yes.
They are mutually dependent.
One impacts and influences the other.
Yeah.
Positively or negatively. So there's a choice.
Right.
There.
But the choice we're making, I believe, is by dignifying the human being. What in fact happens is, you dignify you dignify me. We release our boundaries. I think this is the most exciting part for any business, and not only for the business, for oneself. Once we realize that the boundaries do not exist, the boundaries have mostly been imposed, who knows why or where. Once those boundaries are lifted, we evidence to ourselves tremendous capacity. We offer innovation, we offer productivity. Do you know something else? When you get this in gear, and you actually engage this mutual reciprocal engagement between the business and the individual and the business. And when you get it working at all these levels, life becomes really, really enjoyable. It's a lot of fun.
I was going to say, and so when if we're speaking specifically about a work environment
Mhm.
or
Right.
workspace, if you think about how an individual feels, or a group, or a team, or
Yeah.
a subdivision within, that then trickles out and over into other arenas of your life, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's there's a proper word for that, but it's, when you get one field well planted, it has a funny way of getting all the other fields well planted. You know, Anybody who's got a garden knows that when you've got one part of the garden doing well, it migrates to the other, unless you want to keep the weeds in it.
Right.
And one of
And so
the
you mentioned sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
no, go on, please. Go on.
I was going to say, so you mentioned at the beginning that we're going to be doing a series
Hmm.
in regards to this. Are
Yeah.
there specific topics that you
Right.
had in mind we could entice our listeners or share with our listeners, so for what they could anticipate or expect?
There are two answers to that. The first one is that we're going to be going through all of the ingredients that make up living and or existing, and the ingredients that make up thriving. So under the thriving, for example, you've got words like relationship, roots, silence, all kinds of things that just make life really, really interesting and expansive.
Right.
That, and then of course how this applies across the human spectrum of body, mind, and spirit. But there's one other thing we have to be very aware of. Our role in Respectonomics is to draw alongside people.
Yeah.
Our work is aspirational, it's organic. I believe and hope, pray that it is inspirational. And I pray that it gives people a better chance to discriminate in their lives between the good values and the bad values. And that being said, we have to be in Respectonomics. We have to be very careful that we're not what I call imposing beliefs,
Yeah.
but rather turning it around to saying, here is the platform. Which part of the platform do you want to hear about? Which part matters to you? So this is a plea to the listeners and the lookers to say, let us know which part of your life or lives or other people's lives you would like to hear about and to have us think about and work on.
Well, it's an opportunity, or we're here to help facilitate thought
Absolutely.
and an awareness, and then
Hmm.
helping you
Yeah.
segue
Right.
in those
But
thoughts and help
but
you
as you
support.
know, we've one of our other discussions we pointed out, you have to be very careful not to assume what people need is, but rather to let people come and tell us what they need. So that's a plea to the audience to say, tell us, because the
Right.
more you tell us, reciprocally speaking, the more we can do for other people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think on that note, I rest my case.
Thank you, Jeremy. We look forward to the future episodes.
Thanks, Sarah.